Hey guys, tonight we're going to travel back in time, way back to a place that feels both incredibly ancient and strangely dusty. Picture a vast, shimmering desert stretching out under an impossibly wide sky, where the sun beats down relentlessly, turning the sand and rock into a canvas of golds, oranges, and burnt sienna. Now imagine you're standing there, the dryness in your throat, the heat radiating up from the ground, maybe a faint salty breeze carrying whispers from the distant ocean. It's a landscape that doesn't immediately scream thriving civilization. And honestly, just thinking about trying to survive there is enough to make you want to curl up and take a nap right now. You probably won't survive trying to cross it without modern supplies, let's be real. But survive they did, deep in the quiet hush of this forgotten land along the coast of what's now northern Peru, lived a people called the Moche. And they left behind some incredible secrets buried in the sand secrets that sometimes, well, they might just glow. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, let me know down in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We're stepping back in time, not just a few centuries, but over 1,000 years, settling into the rhythms of a world sculpted by sun, sand, and fleeting water. Imagine the quiet, not the quiet of a library or a sleeping house, but the deep, resonant quiet of an ancient desert at dusk. The air cools just a little, and the stars begin to pierce the velvet sky, thousands upon thousands, because there's no city light for hundreds of miles to drown them out. This was the world of the Moche, a civilization that flourished on the northern coast of Peru, roughly between 100 and 800 CE. To put that into perspective, this was around the time the Roman Empire was in its later stages, the Maya were building their great cities in Mesoamerica, and kingdoms were rising and falling across Eurasia. But here, tucked away in the arid strip between the towering Andes Mountains and the vast Pacific Ocean, the Moche were creating something entirely unique. Their homeland was a place of stark contrast. You had the relentless, bone-dry desert, a place where rainfall is almost non-existent for years on end. Walking across it, you'd feel the fine dust coating everything, getting into your clothes, settling on your skin. The landscape would seem endless, undulating dunes, rocky outcrops, weathered by wind into strange, haunting shapes. It's easy to feel lost and small in such a place, just a tiny speck against the immensity of the land and sky. Think about the sheer quiet patience of the desert. It doesn't hurry, it just is. It waits, and it holds on to secrets for a very, very long time. But interspersed within this vast, arid expanse were ribbons of life, fertile river valleys. Fed by snowmelt trickling down from the high Andes, these rivers slice through the desert, bringing precious water from the mountains to the sea. These valleys were the heart of the Moche world. Here the brown dust gave way to vibrant green. Lush fields, carefully tended gardens, and groves of trees sprang up along the riverbanks. This is where the Moche built their homes, their temples, and their cities. It's where they grew their crops: maize beans, squash peanuts, and even cotton. It's a testament to their ingenuity that they could coax such abundance from such a challenging environment. To understand the Moche, you have to understand this environment. It shaped everything they did, from their agriculture to their beliefs. The constant struggle for water, the dependence on the unpredictable mountain runoff, the sheer power of the desert itself, these forces were ever present in their lives. Imagine living with that kind of dependency, knowing that your entire way of life hinged on whether the rivers kept flowing. It gives you a different perspective on time, on the natural world, and on the things that truly matter. The Moche weren't the first people to live on this coast, but they were arguably the most sophisticated and influential of their time in this region. They developed complex irrigation systems that allowed them to expand agriculture far beyond the natural floodplains, channeling water for miles across the desert floor. Think about the sheer engineering feat involved in that, especially without modern tools or surveying equipment. It required incredible coordination planning and a deep understanding of the landscape. Building these canals would have been back-breaking work, requiring the collective effort of communities, a rhythm of digging and moving earth under the hot sun. It's a sleepy thought, really, the slow, steady progress of building something monumental day after day for generations. Their society was highly organized with distinct social classes and powerful rulers. We know a surprising amount about them, not primarily from written records. They didn't have a writing system like ours, but from what they left behind, especially their pottery and their burials. And honestly, their pottery is wild. While other cultures made beautiful pots, the Moche created ceramics that were incredibly realistic, almost photographic in their detail. They depicted everything from rulers and warriors to farmers, fishermen, animals, and even intimate scenes of daily life and religious rituals. It's like they created a massive, unedited documentary series in clay, giving us this unparalleled window into their world. It's a quirky tidbit how much raw, uncensored reality they captured in mud. You see everything from someone harvesting crops to, well, let's just say some very detailed depictions of human activities that are decidedly not PG. But those specific pots aren't what we're focusing on tonight, thankfully. We're sticking to the sleepier side of things. Historians still argue whether the Moche were a single unified state, ruled from a central capital, or if they were more of a confederation of independent valley chiefdoms who shared a common culture and religious beliefs. Was there one big boss, or were there several regional big bosses who mostly got along? It's a debate that highlights how challenging it is to reconstruct the political structure of a long-vanished society based on archaeological evidence alone. You see the shared styles, the similar monumental architecture, the widespread religious iconography, but figuring out the exact lines of power and authority, that's where things get fuzzy, like trying to remember the details of a dream right after you wake up. Despite the unknowns, it's clear they were a powerful and innovative people. They were skilled metalworkers creating intricate objects from gold, silver, and copper, often using techniques like gilding and inlay. Their monumental architecture, like the vast adobe brick pyramids, known as the Huasas del Sol and de la Luna temples of the sun and moon in the Moche Valley, still dominates the landscape today, silent witnesses to the scale of their ambitions and their ability to mobilize labor. Imagine the countless adobe bricks, each sun-dried, stacked one upon the other, year after year, growing into these massive structures that seem to rise organically from the desert floor. It's a slow, steady, calming image, the rhythm of building, of creating something enduring against the relentless forces of nature. The Moche economy was based on agriculture, fishing. The ocean was another vital resource in trade. They traded with other groups along the coast, and in the highlands exchanging goods like spondylus shell, highly prized for ritual use, textiles, metals, and ceramics. This exchange of ideas and materials helped to spread Moche influence and culture across a wide area. It's easy to imagine the caravans moving slowly through the desert passes, or the reed boats plying the coastal waters, a quiet hum of activity under the vast sky. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of Moche society, the part that truly opens a window into their beliefs and their view of the world, is found beneath the sand. The way they treated their dead and the objects they chose to bury with them tells us volumes about their hopes, their fears, and their understanding of what happened after life ended. And it's these burials tucked away in the dry earth that hold the key to the strange, faint glow we'll explore later tonight. For now, let's just rest with the image of that vast, silent desert, the occasional green valley, and the quiet, powerful presence of a people who made this challenging landscape their home, leaving behind whispers of their lives and their beliefs in the dust. Think of the wind carrying the fine grains across the dunes, a constant, gentle movement, slowly covering, slowly preserving, slowly holding on to secrets for us to one day uncover. It's a timeless, peaceful thought, the slow march of the sand. So you're settled in the quiet, feeling the dry, cool air of the Moche world starting to wrap around you. We were just thinking about the silence of the desert and the river valleys where the Moche lived. And you know, one of the quietest places of all, but paradoxically one of the loudest. In terms of what it tells us is a grave, especially when you don't have old diaries or history books written by the people themselves. The Moche didn't leave us scrolls or stone inscriptions detailing their political history or daily routines like some other ancient folks did. No king lists, no epic poems carved for posterity. So to understand them, to piece together their lives and their beliefs, we have to rely heavily on archaeology. And for the Moche, the most information-rich sites are often their cemeteries and tombs. Think of it like this. Imagine someone hundreds or thousands of years from now trying to understand your life just by looking at what you left behind. Your house, your clothes, your phone charger. They'll probably be very confused by that. Maybe the things you kept in your closet. For the Moche, what they deliberately put in the ground with their dead is like a curated collection of clues, a snapshot of their world, their status, and what they thought came next. It's a window, slightly dusty perhaps, into their hearts and minds. And because the northern Peruvian desert is so incredibly dry organic materials, things that would normally just vanish in wetter climates, can sometimes be remarkably well preserved. Textiles, wood, even occasionally human remains themselves, can survive, offering details that would otherwise be lost to time. It's like the desert decided to be a natural museum curator, albeit a very slow and secretive one. Digging into a Moche burial is like opening a very old, very personal time capsule. You carefully remove the layers of earth, feeling the fine, dry soil shift under your tools, maybe smelling the deep mineral scent of the desert floor, and slowly, painstakingly, you begin to uncover objects. Pots often beautifully decorated, sometimes depicting scenes from life or myth. Metal ornaments, shimmering gold, silver, or copper, worn by the deceased or placed around them. Tools, weapons, textiles, food offerings, even sacrificed animals or people in some high-status tombs. Each item wasn't just randomly tossed in, it was chosen, deliberately placed, presumably for a reason tied to their beliefs about the afterlife. This practice of burying objects with the dead, known as grave goods, is common in many cultures throughout history. But the sheer variety and quality of Moche grave goods, especially in the burials of their elite, are astonishing. They buried rulers, warriors, priests, and craftspeople with incredible wealth and displays of power. Finding a tomb like that of the Lord of Sipan, uncovered in the late 1980s, was a mainstream historical fact that absolutely revolutionized our understanding of the Moche elite. It was untouched by looters, filled with exquisite gold and silver regalia shell and stone ornaments and thousands of pottery vessels. It showed a level of social stratification and centralized power that had only been guessed at before. It was like finding the presidential library, the national treasury, and the royal wardrobe all in one spot, buried deep under the sand. It certainly makes you think about what you would want packed for eternity. Probably something comfy, maybe a good book, definitely snacks. The Moche went for gold headdresses and ceremonial knives. Different priorities, I guess. The range of burials, from simple pits with just a few pots to elaborate multi-layered tombs packed with riches and accompanied by other individuals, gives us clear evidence of a complex social hierarchy. Not everyone got the gold-plated send-off. Most people were likely buried with much simpler offerings reflecting their status in life. You can almost see the social ladder reflected in the ground beneath you, each burial a rung from the humble farmer to the powerful lord. Historians still argue whether the richness of grave goods always perfectly reflected the person's actual power or wealth during their lifetime, or if sometimes it was more about their status within a particular ritual or mythical context. Was that person buried with a war club, a fearsome warrior, or someone who participated in a specific ritual battle? Did all that gold belong to them personally, or was it communal wealth buried to honor their office? It's a nuanced question, trying to decipher the exact meaning behind every object. You're essentially reading symbols in silence, trying to understand a language without a dictionary. One quirky or fringe tidbit that stands out in some Moche burials is the inclusion of copper items, especially copper ornaments, or tools that show signs of deliberate killing or breaking before being placed in the tomb. It's like they intentionally decommissioned the objects, perhaps believing their spirit or essence needed to be released to accompany the deceased into the next world. Or maybe it was just to prevent looting by making the objects less useful. But the idea of ritually killing objects is a fascinating and slightly spooky one, adding another layer to their complex relationship with material things and the afterlife. Imagine breaking your favorite mug so its spirit could go with you. Seems a bit extreme, but who are we to judge ancient packing preferences? So when you think about the Moche picture, not just the pyramids and the pottery, but the quiet spaces beneath the earth. These burials are where the most personal, most revealing stories are told. They speak of a society deeply concerned with status, power, and the journey after death. They show us skilled craftspeople, powerful leaders, and a people with a rich, complex spiritual life. And among the many fascinating objects buried with the Moche dead, there's one category that is particularly intriguing, especially when you think about that potential glow we mentioned. It's the world of metals and how they were used, transformed, and sometimes given a life or maybe an afterlife of their own. As you feel the weight of that thought settle the idea of objects accompanying souls, let your mind drift gently towards the materials themselves, waiting quietly in the dark earth. You're floating now just above the quiet earth, where those Moche burials lie, feeling the stillness and the stories waiting to be told. We were just easing into the idea that what the Moche buried with their dead, especially the rich stuff, gives us a huge window into their lives and beliefs. And among all the fascinating grave goods, the pottery, the textiles, the sacrificed llamas, yep, llamas. The metal objects are arguably the most stunning and perhaps the most revealing when we think about things that might glow. Imagine yourself standing in a Mocha workshop, maybe near the coast, a place bustling with quiet, focused activity. The air smells faintly of charcoal fires and perhaps a metallic tang. You see people working with raw materials that seem almost magical, gold shimmering with the intense light of the sun they revered. Silver cool and pale like the moon, often found in the same locations as gold, creating a natural duality. Copper reddish and strong, the workhorse metal, but also used in alloys to mimic gold or silver. The Moche were absolute masters of metalworking, reaching a level of sophistication in techniques that was in some ways ahead of many cultures elsewhere in the world at the same time. They didn't just bash metal into shape, they understood its properties deeply. They got their metals from the Andes trading networks, bringing raw ores down to the valleys where their cities were. It wasn't easy work, mining, smelting, refining, but the Moche clearly placed immense value on these materials, not just for their beauty or utility, but for their inherent symbolism. Gold was linked to the male, the sun life and vitality. Silver was linked to the female, the moon coolness, and perhaps the underworld or the night. Copper, more earthly, was vital for tools and weapons, but also had symbolic value often used in combination with gold or silver. This duality of gold and silver sun and moon male and female runs through much of Moche art and symbolism, and it's powerfully present in their metalwork. You see it in ornaments where gold figures are paired with silver ones, or where objects are deliberately crafted with alternating gold and silver sections. It's like they were building a little piece of their cosmology right into the bling. It makes you wonder if our preference for certain metals says anything deep about us. Are you a gold person or a silver person? Does that make you sun or moon? Probably just means you like shiny things. Let's be honest. Their techniques were incredibly varied and skillful. They hammered metal into thin sheets, sometimes thinner than paper, then cut and shaped it. They used repoussé hammering details from the back to make designs stand out on the front, creating intricate patterns and figures on masks, headdresses, and pectorals, chest ornaments. Imagine the patient rhythmic tapping, slowly coaxing a face or a complex mythical scene out of a flat sheet of gold. They were sculpting with hammers, basically. They also knew how to solder pieces together, seamlessly creating complex multi-part objects. And they were pioneers in creating alloys, mixing copper with gold or silver to make materials like tumbaga. Tumbaga is fascinating because it allowed them to stretch their precious metals further, but also crucially, they developed a technique called depletion gilding. Depletion gilding is a bit like ancient alchemy, a truly mind-bending process. They would make an object out of tumbaga, which is mostly copper, with some gold or silver. Then they would heat it and treat the surface with corrosive substances, like plant acids, which would dissolve away the copper from the surface layer, leaving a thin but pure layer of gold or silver right on top. The object was still mostly base metal inside, but it looked like pure gold or silver. It was a brilliant way to get the appearance of solid, precious metal without using vast amounts of it. It's kind of like getting a really fancy gold-plated phone case. Looks legit, costs less, fools the eye. But the Moche were doing this 1,500 years ago on a massive scale with ceremonial objects meant for gods and rulers. It shows a deep understanding of metallurgy and chemistry, a real mainstream historical fact about their advanced technical skills. They weren't just melting stuff down, they were manipulating metals at a chemical level on the surface. Think about the massive gold and silver ornaments found in tombs like the Lord of Sea Ponds. Giant crescent headdresses, intricate ear ornaments, pectorals covering the entire chest, even metal coverings for the feet. These weren't things you could wear to a Moche party unless you were the Moche party host, possibly with a bodyguard, just to help you stand up straight. They were heavy, elaborate pieces designed for ceremony, for displaying power and connection to the divine. Wearing these was making a statement not just about wealth, but about who you were in the cosmic order. You weren't just a ruler. You were a conduit between worlds dressed in the sun and moon. The sheer quantity of high-quality metalwork buried with the elite is staggering. It suggests that control over metal production and distribution was central to their power structure. The rulers likely controlled the mines, the workshops, and the skilled artisans. Being able to commission and distribute such wealth would solidify their authority and demonstrate their divine favor. Finding a workshop debris pile filled with tiny, perfectly formed metal parts or the remnants of crucible furnaces gives you a tangible connection to this industry that underpinned their society. One quirky or fringe tidbit about Moche metal use comes from their representations, sometimes in pottery or on metal objects themselves, of figures engaged in what look like ritual battles or sacrifices. The warriors often wear elaborate metal regalia. Some interpretations suggest that capturing warriors from other groups provided not just captives for sacrifice, but also valuable metal ornaments to be melted down and repurposed or used as trophies. So warfare wasn't just about territory, it might also have been in part about acquiring shiny stuff. Imagine going to war just to get your enemy's cool jewelry. Seems inefficient, but maybe that was part of the Moche strategy. Attack Squad Alpha. Your objective is the enemy's solid gold ear spools. Historians still argue whether the scale of Moche metal production indicates a state-controlled economy where the elite tightly managed all aspects from mining to burial, or if there was more regional variation and independent production among craftspeople. Were these artisans essentially state employees, or were they highly valued individuals with some degree of autonomy working under royal patronage? The uniformity of some styles across different valleys suggests some level of central control or strong cultural exchange, while regional differences hint at local traditions. Think about the objects themselves as they lay buried. The gold would retain its shine, resisting corrosion. Silver would tarnish, turning dark, but could be polished clean. Copper and tumbaga would often corrode, turning green or blue-green, depending on the soil conditions, sometimes forming mineral crusts. But even in their corroded state, they hold clues. The shape, the remnants of decoration, the context within the burial, it all adds to the story. And sometimes, just sometimes under the right conditions, the way these metals, particularly copper alloys, interact with minerals in the soil over centuries can lead to unexpected effects. Effects that might just perhaps link to the idea of something glowing in the dark. These metal objects, silent witnesses to Moche. Life and death weren't just pretty ornaments. They were infused with meaning, power, and perhaps a hint of something luminescent waiting in the deep past. We've just spent some time marinating in the incredible skill and symbolism of Moche metalwork, particularly those shiny, heavy objects destined for eternity. Now let's gently shift our focus from the creation of these artifacts to their final resting place. You are now hovering quietly above the very ground where those workshops once hummed, a land dotted with ancient mounds and pyramids, built layer upon layer by human hands. This is where the Moche laid their dead to rest, and understanding how they were buried and what was placed with them is like reading a very elaborate, very old book about their souls. The Moche buried their dead in various ways, reflecting social status and perhaps regional customs. There were simple pit burials for commoners, sometimes multiple individuals together, perhaps wrapped in textiles. But the burials that capture the imagination and hold the most spectacular artifacts are the elite ones. The rulers, priests, and high-status individuals. These weren't just holes in the ground. They were often elaborate tombs, sometimes massive chambers dug into the earth beneath impressive adobe brick platforms, or pyramids like the famous Huacas de Moche near Trujillo, or the site of Sipan further north. Imagine a giant step pyramid of sun-dried bricks baked hard under the fierce coastal sun, and deep beneath it a hidden world prepared for the journey to the next life. You can picture the painstaking work involved. Excavating the earth lining the chamber walls, perhaps with more adobe bricks or even timber. Creating a space that was meant to last sealed against the world of the living. Within these chambers, the body of the deceased would be carefully laid out. Often they were placed in a supine position, lying on their backs sometimes, within a simple coffin or wrapped in layers of fine textiles. But it wasn't just the body. The entire space was curated. This wasn't a rushed affair. Every object, every placement seems to have been deeply considered. Think about walking into one of these unearthed tombs for the first time in your imagination, of course. Disturb nothing. The air would be still dry after centuries, dust motes dancing in the shaft of light illuminating the space. And there surrounding the central figure are the grave goods. They weren't just tossed in randomly, like throwing things in a box before you move house. They were placed on the body, beside the body, in specific locations within the chamber. The magnificent metalwork we talked about, it would be on the person. Headdresses towering above the head ear, ornaments filling the lobes, necklaces around the neck, pectorals covering the chest, bracelets and anklets, rings on fingers and toes, even metallic sandals or coverings for the feet. It was a literal suit of power and divinity. But it wasn't just metal. There were pottery vessels, often finely painted ones depicting scenes of Moche life mythology or rituals. Textiles, though often deteriorated, hint at elaborate clothing and burial wrappings. Shells, particularly spondylus shell from faraway Ecuador, highly prized for its vibrant color and association with water and fertility. Beads of stone and shell intricately crafted. Sometimes even sacrificed animals like llamas, or in the most elaborate burials, human retainers sacrificed to accompany their lord into the afterlife. It's a whole entourage and a whole inventory of symbolic objects, all meticulously arranged. The deliberate arrangement of these artifacts speaks volumes. Placing ear ornaments might signify the ability to hear the divine or communicate in the spirit world. Covering the chest with a pectoral could protect the heart or signify status and strength. Having pottery vessels filled with offerings near the head or hands suggests provisions for the journey. The inclusion of spondylus shell points to connections with vital life forces and distant powerful places. This wasn't just burying stuff you liked. It was equipping the deceased for a transformation, a passage. A mainstream historical fact is that the Moche elite burials are consistently found associated with major ceremonial centers, indicating the close link between political power, religious authority, and control over life and death rituals. They didn't just bury the ruler near the temple, they buried him under it. Consider the sheer weight and value of these objects, especially the metal ones. Placing them on the body in direct contact suggests they weren't just possessions, but were integral to the deceased's identity and power in the afterlife. It's like dressing someone in their essential nature before they meet the gods. Imagine the final moments before the tomb was sealed. The careful positioning of every piece, the final offerings laid down, the heavy silence descending as the living withdrew. A quirky or fringe tidbit you sometimes find in Moche burials involves the intentional killing of objects. Some pottery vessels are found with a deliberate hole punched through the base, or some metal objects might be bent or broken. This is sometimes interpreted as killing the object so its spirit or essence could accompany the deceased, or perhaps to prevent it from being reused by the living. It's a fascinating idea, breaking something valuable so it could serve its owner in another realm. It makes you think about decommissioning old tech. Is that our modern, less dramatic version of killing the object? Probably not, unless your old iPhone is joining you in the great Wi-Fi in the sky. Historians still argue whether the specific arrangements of artifacts in Moche tombs followed a single rigid template across the entire Moche territory, or if there were significant regional variations and individual preferences. While common themes exist, metal regalia for elites' pottery offerings, the exact layout and combination of objects differ from tomb to tomb and from one Moche valley to another. Does this variation represent different lineages, different religious beliefs, or simply the artistic license of the tomb preparers? It's a puzzle that keeps archaeologists poring over excavation maps and artifact inventories. As these objects settled into the dark earth surrounded by soil minerals and the slow, inexorable march of geological time, they began their long vigil. The gold remained perhaps glinting faintly if caught by a stray beam during collapse. The silver tarnished. The copper and its alloys began their slow dance with the chemistry of the earth around them. And it is in this silent, buried context among the bones and the beads and the broken pottery that some of these materials, after centuries of transformation, began to acquire properties entirely unforeseen by the Moche artisans. Properties that would eventually lead curious minds to wonder about things that glowed in the dark. These tombs weren't just graves. They were time capsules preserving not just objects, but potential reactions waiting to be discovered. As those carefully placed objects settled into the silent darkness of the Moche tombs, a new incredibly slow drama began. The living world above sealed them away, but the world beneath the soil is far from inert. It's a constantly shifting environment, a soup of minerals, moisture gases, and microscopic life. And over the centuries, this environment began to work on everything buried within its embrace. Think of it like putting something precious away in a damp cellar and coming back 1,000 years later. Things are not going to look the same. Different materials reacted in very different ways to this underground existence. The adobe bricks of the tomb walls themselves would slowly compact, perhaps absorb moisture and swell, then dry and crack. Eventually, many tomb structures collapsed under the weight of the earth above. Organic materials, the bodies themselves, the fine cotton or wool textiles, they were wrapped in wooden components of coffins or furniture offerings of food or plants. These generally fared poorly. Bacteria and fungi got to work breaking down the complex organic molecules. Unless conditions were exceptionally dry or somehow anaerobic, lacking oxygen, most of this stuff simply rotted away. What remains are often just faint stains in the soil, or sometimes mineralized fragments where bone or wood has been replaced molecule by minerals from the surrounding earth, turning soft tissue into stone over eons. It's the ultimate slow-motion transformation, like watching paint dry, if the paint was also turning into a mountain range. The inorganic materials like pottery and stone beads were much more stable. Fired clay is, after all, basically artificial rock. Pottery vessels might break under the pressure of collapsing tomb structures or shifting soil, but the material itself doesn't decay in the biological sense. Its surface might alter slightly due to mineral deposits from groundwater, or salts might crystallize on it in dry environments causing flaking. But the fundamental structure of the clay remains. Stone beads and ornaments likewise are largely impervious to the slow assault of time. Underground, their hardness and chemical composition protecting them. They sit there largely unchanged, silent witnesses to the decay happening all around them. But the metals, the metals. This is where things get particularly interesting for our story. Gold, as the Moche knew, is remarkably stable. It barely reacts with anything in typical soil environments. That's why Moche gold ornaments are often found looking almost as brilliant as the day they were buried, perhaps just needing a gentle cleaning to remove surface dirt. Silver tarnishes readily reacting with sulfur compounds in the air and soil to form black silver sulfides. You've seen this happen to your grandma's silverware if it's left out. Now imagine that happening for 1,500 years underground. Copper and its alloys, like the copper gold silver tumbaga we discussed, are much more reactive than gold or even silver. When buried in soil, copper interacts with moisture-dissolved salts gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide before the tomb becomes truly sealed and oxygen depleted, and even organic acids produced by decaying matter and microbes. This leads to the formation of various copper compounds on the surface, a process we commonly call patination or corrosion. It's the green or blue layer you see on old copper roofs or statues. That's a patina, a layer of copper carbonates, chlorides, sulfates, or oxides. Underground, in the complex chemistry of the soil, the types of compounds that form can be even more varied and complex. It's like the earth is trying out every single recipe it knows using copper as the main ingredient. This slow chemical dance between the buried metal and its environment is absolutely crucial. The original metal object, a pectoral and ear ornament, a bead, doesn't just sit there unchanged. Its surface and sometimes deeper layers are transformed into new mineral phases. The exact composition of these new minerals depends heavily on the local soil chemistry, the amount of moisture, the presence of specific elements like sulfur or chlorine, and the amount of oxygen available. A mainstream historical fact relevant here is that the study of how archaeological materials decay, known as archaeometry or archaeological science, is a vital field that helps us understand not just how objects survive, but also the environmental conditions of ancient sites. It's like forensic science for old dirt. A quirky or fringe tidbit you might encounter is that sometimes the corrosion products on a metal object can actually preserve traces of organic material that were in contact with it like fragments of textiles or wood. As the metal corrodes, it can replace the organic structure, essentially casting it in metal salts. It's like the metal's decay process is creating a fossil of whatever it touched, giving us incredibly detailed glimpses into materials that should have long vanished. Imagine finding the faint imprint of a specific fabric weave, preserved only where it touched a copper object. It's like a ghostly hug frozen in time by chemistry. Historians and archaeologists still argue whether the Moche had any deliberate understanding of how certain materials would endure underground when choosing grave goods. Did they select materials based purely on their symbolic value in life? Or did they have an empirical understanding, perhaps passed down through generations of observing older burials, of what lasted and what didn't in their specific soil conditions? Was the durability of gold part of its appeal? Or just a happy accident from a funerary perspective? It's hard to know if they were thinking about the far future or just the immediate needs of the journey to the afterlife. So as the centuries rolled by, the Moche tombs became micro-laboratories of decay and transformation. The bodies turned to dust, the textiles disintegrated, but the metals, especially those copper alloys, began their slow metamorphosis. And it is within the complex, newly formed mineral layers on the surface of these copper objects, interacting with elements present in the burial environment, elements like sulfur, that the potential for something truly extraordinary began to emerge. This process of chemical change wasn't just degradation, it was in a strange and unforeseen way a preparation, a setting of the stage for a faint, unexpected light to eventually appear. So as those centuries ticked by, the transformation was happening, not just decay into dust, but a complex chemical alchemy in the dark earth. The stage wasn't just set, it was being actively prepared by the environment itself. And a key, perhaps unexpected player in this slow subterranean drama was sulfur. Now you might know sulfur best from that distinct rotten egg smell, which is hydrogen sulfide gas, often released during the breakdown of organic matter. But sulfur is also present in various forms in rocks, minerals, and dissolved in groundwater. It's just around quietly doing its thing in the soil. In a sealed Moche tomb, especially one containing decaying bodies and other organic materials, sulfur compounds would have been readily available. As bacteria broke down tissues and plant matter, they produced these sulfurous gases and acids. These substances then seeped into the tiny spaces within the burial environment, reaching the metal objects resting there. Think of it as a very, very slow-motion gas attack on expensive jewelry. Not the kind of attack you'd survive with a gas mask, mind you, because this one takes 1,000 years. And the copper alloys, they were prime targets. While the surface was already busy forming oxides and carbonates from reacting with air and moisture, before the tomb was fully sealed, and later interacting with groundwater salts and soil minerals, the arrival of sulfur added a whole new dimension. Copper has a strong affinity for sulfur. When exposed to sulfur compounds, copper atoms on the surface of the metal object, or even within the existing corrosion layers, would begin to react, forming copper sulfides. These copper sulfides are typically dark, often black materials. You might see them forming on copper pipes in your house if your water has high sulfur content. Blackening is a classic sign of copper sulfide formation. Underground over centuries, these sulfides would build up as part of the increasingly complex corrosion layer on the Moche metal objects. It wasn't just a simple layer, it was a patchwork, a stratified crust of different copper minerals. Greens, blues, reds, and now crucially blacks and dark grays from the sulfides all mixed together on the surface of the original metal. It was like the metal was growing a mineral coat and sulfur was a key ingredient in the recipe. This slow, steady buildup of copper sulfides on the surface of the metal objects was absolutely critical. It wasn't just another form of decay, it was the creation of a specific chemical phase that would later be essential for the phenomenon we're leading up to. The exact conditions, how much sulfur was present, the pH of the soil, the moisture levels, the availability of other elements, would influence exactly which type of copper sulfide formed and how much of it. Some burial environments might have been richer in sulfur than others, leading to more extensive sulfide formation. It was a geological lottery played out over a millennium, determining the final chemical makeup of the metal surfaces. A mainstream historical fact that's relevant here: is the Moche people's sophisticated knowledge of metallurgy. They weren't just banging rocks together. They mastered techniques like depletion gilding, which made copper, gold, silver alloys look like pure gold and soldering. While we're talking about natural corrosion here, their deep empirical understanding of how metals behaved, melting, mixing, shaping, even surface treatments, suggests they had a certain level of chemical intuition, even if they didn't understand atomic structures or chemical formulas like we do. They knew how to make metals do what they wanted. A quirky or fringe tidbit about this process is that ancient cultures sometimes deliberately added sulfurous materials to burials, not necessarily for chemical reactions, but for ritualistic purposes perhaps related to purification or warding off spirits, or even symbolic associations with fire or the underworld. Whether the Moche ever did this intentionally is unknown, but the presence of naturally occurring sulfur in the soil, combined with organic decay, provided all the ingredients needed for the sulfide formation we're interested in. It's like nature was providing the necessary elements for a later magic trick, even if the people bearing the objects weren't aware of that specific chemical outcome. Historians and archaeologists still argue whether the Moche had any form of deliberate environmental control or modification within their tombs beyond the basic structure and grave goods. Did they select burial locations based on soil properties? Did they add specific types of clay or other materials that might influence preservation or perhaps unintentionally chemical reactions? Or were the chemical transformations we see simply the passive result of placing metal objects in the prevailing local soil conditions and allowing nature to take its incredibly slow, complex course? It's a tough question to answer without direct evidence, leaving room for plenty of scholarly head-scratching. So there you have it. Over vast stretches of time, the Moche metals, particularly the copper-rich alloys, didn't just corrode into dust. They underwent a specific sulfur-fueled transformation on their surfaces. They grew these complex layers of mineral compounds, and within those layers, copper sulfides became an increasingly important component. These dark mineralized surfaces might not look like much to the untrained eye, just old tarnished metal, but chemically speaking, they were now primed. They held within their crystalline structures the potential for something truly unexpected, something that required centuries of quiet chemical change in the dark earth to develop. The stage was set, the critical components were in place, forged in the slow furnace of underground chemistry. So after centuries of quiet chemical change in the dark earth, with those copper sulfides slowly, inexorably forming on the surface of the metal objects, the stage was set. But for what? For a long, long time, nothing much happened, at least not in a way that humans could perceive. The tombs remained hidden, undisturbed sometimes for 1,000 years or more, protecting their secrets and the slow mineral transformation underway within. The Moche themselves faded into history, their cities crumbling, their canals silting up their intricate pottery and metalwork, waiting patiently underground. Their language became a mystery. Their exact political structures, debated their rituals, only pieced together from what they left behind and what they buried. Then relatively recently in the grand sweep of time, the archaeologists arrived. Not exactly with bullwhips and fedoras, more likely with trowels, brushes, and a lot of bureaucratic paperwork, but archaeologists nonetheless. They began to systematically uncover these ancient sites along the northern coast of Peru. They dug into the earth, carefully peeling back the layers of time, revealing walls, plazas, and crucially burials. And as they opened these tombs, particularly those containing significant amounts of Moche metalwork, pectorals, crowns, ear ornaments, masks, even simple metal tools, they started to notice something strange. It wasn't every tomb, and it wasn't every object, but sometimes in the dim light of the excavation site, or perhaps back in the laboratory or museum storage facility after the objects had been recovered, people began to see a faint, eerie luminescence, a soft, ethereal glow emanating from the surface of some of these ancient metal pieces. Not a bright flashlight-level glow, mind you, more like the weak shimmer of an old watch dial in the dark, or the faint light from a distant firefly. Sometimes it was greenish, sometimes bluish, sometimes a pale yellowish hue. It was subtle, easily missed in bright light, but undeniably present when viewed in darkness. Imagine being an archaeologist carefully cataloging an artifact that's been buried for 1,500 years. You're probably tired, covered in dust, maybe dreaming of a cold drink and a shower. You wrap up the object, maybe place it in a box in a dim corner, and then out of the corner of your eye you catch it, a faint, inexplicable gleam. You double-check your light source, wave your hand in front of it, but the light persists, seeming to come from out the object itself. It would be enough to make you wonder if you'd inhaled a bit too much dust, or maybe if the ghost of the person buried with the object was trying to send you a message. You'd probably try to rationalize it, maybe think it was just a reflection, or maybe some odd dust particle catching the light. But when it happened repeatedly with different objects from different tombs, the rationalizations started to wear thin. This wasn't a phenomenon that was immediately publicized or understood. For a while, it was more of an inside baseball kind of mystery among the archaeologists and conservators working with Moche metals, whispers and lab-side conversations at conferences. Have you noticed that glow on the such and such piece? Yeah, I thought I was seeing things. It was puzzling, a bit spooky, and definitely outside the norm for ancient artifacts, which are typically more about decay than dynamic light displays. It wasn't like finding a treasure chest full of gold, which is exciting but expected. This was finding a treasure chest that occasionally twinkled on its own, which is just plain weird. Initial theories before serious scientific investigation began were all over the place. Could it be some form of slow oxidation reacting with the air? Maybe traces of radioactive elements in the metal or the soil? Was it some biological residue from the burial itself, perhaps fungi or bacteria that glowed? Could the Moche have somehow coated the objects with a phosphorescent substance, a kind of ancient glow-in-the-dark paint? That last idea was particularly intriguing. Imagine Moche warriors heading into battle with glowing breastplates, intimidating their enemies, not just with intricate designs, but with a spectral shine. Though realistically, the glow was too faint for that, probably only visible in deep darkness. Of course, archaeologists being archaeologists, they weren't content with spooky theories and whispers. They started to document the phenomenon more rigorously. They noted which objects glowed from which tombs they came and what their surface appearance was like. They tried moving the objects into complete darkness and observing them. They exposed them to different light sources, natural daylight, artificial lamps, even UV light, to see if that influenced the glow. And they brought in the scientists, the materials experts, the chemists, to try and figure out what was actually happening on a molecular level. A mainstream historical fact that provides context here is the sheer richness and craftsmanship of Moche metallurgy. While the Romans and Greeks are often highlighted for their metalwork in the Western canon, the Moche were their contemporaries and arguably surpassed them in certain areas, particularly in techniques for working with copper, silver, gold, and alloys. They produced not just functional tools and weapons, but incredibly complex, often narrative ceremonial objects. Masks depicting supernatural beings, intricate finials showing mythological scenes, pectorals embossed with complex patterns. The fact that these objects were the ones exhibiting this strange glow just added another layer to their already impressive legacy. They were not just skilled artisans. They were potentially unintentionally creating objects with unique chemical properties that would manifest centuries later. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to this is the historical association of glowing phenomena with the supernatural or divine in many cultures. Ancient people around the world observed things like phosphorescent fungi, bioluminescent creatures, or even static electricity glows, and often interpreted them as signs from the god spirits or magical forces. If the Moche themselves had ever encountered objects that glowed faintly in the dark, perhaps disturbed burials that were later recovered, they might have attributed it to powerful spiritual forces. While we now seek a scientific explanation, it's interesting to consider how such a phenomenon might have been understood within their own complex cosmological framework, which heavily featured interaction between the living world and the spiritual or underworld realms. It's a shame we don't have a Moche ghost story about a glowing mask coming to life in the dark. Historians and archaeologists still argue whether the Moche viewed their metal objects primarily as wealth, as religious offerings, as symbols of power and status, or as a combination of all these things. While the sheer amount of precious metal in some burials suggests wealth display, the iconography often points strongly towards ritual and mythology. The glowing phenomenon, if it was ever observed by the Moche themselves, which is highly unlikely given the time frame needed for the chemical changes, would almost certainly have been interpreted through a religious or supernatural lens, further complicating our understanding of the object's original function and meaning. It adds another layer to the ongoing debate about the exact role these spectacular artifacts played in Moche society. So the mystery was out. The Moche metals formed centuries ago, buried in specific conditions, were on occasion emitting a faint light in the darkness. It wasn't magic, probably, it wasn't spirits, most likely, but it was definitely something requiring explanation beyond just old and tarnished. The initial confusion gave way to focused scientific inquiry. Researchers needed to understand the chemical nature of the objects, the specific conditions of the burial environments, and crucially, the exact composition and structure of those corrosion layers that had built up over millennia. The stage had been set by nature's slow chemistry, the discovery made by human curiosity, and now the scientific detective work was about to begin peeling back not just layers of soil, but layers of complex chemical transformation to find the secret of the glow. So the mystery was solid. Objects that had been buried for well over 1,000 years were occasionally exhibiting a faint, spooky light show in the dark. It wasn't just one archaeologist seeing things after a long day in the sun. It was a phenomenon observed with multiple pieces from different contexts. This was no longer just a quirky anecdote, it was a scientific puzzle. And when scientists get involved, things get serious. Well, as serious as trying to figure out why really old metal sometimes glows can be. They weren't going to just stare at the objects in a dark room and hope for answers. No, science requires tools analysis and a healthy dose of skepticism. The archaeologists carefully selected some of the glowing artifacts, often focusing on those that had been recovered relatively recently or handled minimally, to reduce the chance that the effect was due to modern contamination or something else entirely. These precious objects, some of them worth fortunes and irreplaceable historical treasures, were subjected to a battery of tests. Don't worry, nobody was sticking them in a microwave or hitting them with a hammer. The tests were non-destructive or involved taking incredibly tiny samples, often measured in micrograms, from inconspicuous spots. Think of it like a doctor taking a pinprick of blood, but for an ancient metal mask. They brought out the big guns of materials science. Techniques like X-ray diffraction XRD, which can tell you the crystalline structure of materials by seeing how they scatter X-rays, were used to identify the mineral compounds present on the surface of the metal. Scanning electron microscopy, SEM with energy dispersive X-ray spectroscopy EDS, allowed them to look at the surface topography in incredible detail, magnified thousands of times, and simultaneously analyze the elemental composition of different areas. Think of it as having a super-powered microscope that can also tell you if you're looking at copper, sulfur, oxygen, or something else entirely pixel by pixel. They also used various forms of spectroscopy, which analyze how light or other energy interacts with the material, revealing its chemical makeup, and even how electrons behave within it. Initial theories were systematically investigated and often ruled out. Was it radioactivity? Sensitive detectors found no significant radiation above background levels? Was it some kind of ancient phosphorescent paint or coating applied by the Moche analysis of the surface layers didn't reveal any organic binders or pigments consistent with known historical paints that could produce such an effect? Plus, the glow seemed to be associated with the corrosion layer, not a deliberate applied coating. Was it biological? While bacteria can do amazing glowing things, hello, bioluminescent fungi in forests, samples taken from the surface didn't show evidence of living or recently deceased microbial communities causing the glow. The focus kept returning to the metal itself, and more specifically, the layer that had formed on the metal over centuries underground. This wasn't just rust. Copper and its alloys corrode in complex ways depending on the environment. The analytical techniques consistently pointed towards the presence of copper sulfide minerals on the surface of the glowing objects. Copper sulfide. Sounds simple, right? Copper plus sulfur. But it's a bit more complicated than that. Copper and sulfur can combine in different ratios and structures, forming different minerals, and their formation is heavily influenced by the surrounding soil chemistry. Remember back when we talked about the burial environment in Section 6, how the soil composition, the moisture levels, and the presence of organic material and groundwater all played a role. Those factors often determine the availability of elements like sulfur in the soil. In environments with decaying organic matter or certain types of soil, sulfur compounds can be relatively abundant. And when these sulfur compounds come into contact with copper metal, buried underground over hundreds or thousands of years, a slow chemical reaction occurs. The copper atoms from the metal surface bond with sulfur atoms from the soil environment, forming layers of copper sulfide. The scientists started to hone in on specific types of copper sulfide. There isn't just one. There are different phases or minerals depending on the ratio of copper to sulfur and the crystal structure. Analysis of the glowing samples often revealed the presence of minerals like chalcocite, Cu2s, or digenite Cu1.8s to Cu1.705, which are copper-rich sulfides. These minerals formed a dark, often iridescent tarnish layer on the surface of the metal. And it was this specific layer, this ancient mineral crust of copper sulfide, that seemed to be the key to the glow. Why would copper sulfide glow? This is where it gets into solid-state physics and mineral luminescence, which is fascinating, but also the kind of thing that could definitely put you to sleep. Minerals can glow, luminesce, for various reasons. Some minerals are naturally fluorescent, meaning they absorb high-energy light like UV, and instantly re-emit it as lower-energy visible light. But that wasn't what was happening here. The Moche objects weren't glowing brightly under UV light and stopping when the light was off. The glow was persistent, visible in the dark after exposure to normal light, a characteristic of phosphorescence. Phosphorescence is a type of luminescence where a material absorbs energy, usually from light, and instead of re-emitting it immediately like fluorescence, it stores that energy temporarily in specific electron states within its crystal structure. Think of the electrons getting a little boost up to a higher energy level. Instead of falling back down to their ground state right away, they get momentarily stuck in trap states. Over time, they gradually release this stored energy by falling back down to their lower state, emitting a photon of light in the process. This slow release is what causes the afterglow that can last for minutes, hours, or even longer in the dark. Common phosphorescent materials often contain impurities or defects in their crystal lattice structure that create these electron traps. Zinc sulfide with traces of copper, for example, is a well-known phosphorescent material used in things like glow-in-the-dark paint. The scientists hypothesized that the copper sulfide minerals forming on the Moche artifacts, particularly chalcocite or digenite, might have structural defects or incorporate tiny amounts of other elements from the burial environment, like iron, silver, or even trace contaminants from the original metal that act as activators or trapping centers for phosphorescence. So the process likely went something like this. The copper artifacts buried for centuries slowly reacted with sulfur in the soil to form a surface layer of copper sulfide minerals. This mineral layer, containing certain structural properties or trace impurities, had the ability to absorb light energy from daylight from archaeological lamps during excavation or even just ambient light in storage. This energy was then stored within the mineral structure. Later, when the objects were in darkness, the stored energy was slowly released as faint visible light, the eerie glow. This explanation tied together the observed phenomena with known material science principles. The glow wasn't magic. It was solid-state chemistry and physics operating over incredibly long timescales. The burial environment provided the necessary sulfur compounds, the centuries provided the time for the reaction to occur, and the mineral layers to form, and the specific crystal structure and composition of those resulting copper sulfides provided the mechanism for absorbing and slowly re-emitting light. A mainstream historical fact that makes this discovery even more significant is the widespread use of copper and its alloys across the ancient Americas. From the Great Lakes region in North America, where native copper was cold hammered into tools and ornaments thousands of years ago, down through Mesoamerica, with cultures like the Olmec and Maya using copper, and extensively in the Andes, with civilizations like the Moche, Tiwanaku, and Inca copper metallurgy, was a cornerstone of technological and artistic achievement. The Moche were particularly advanced in alloying gilding and working with copper and tumbaga, a gold-copper alloy, but copper sulfides forming as corrosion products would be a common occurrence on copper artifacts buried in many locations across the continent. This means the potential for this burial glow phenomenon might not be exclusive to the Moche. although the specific conditions in their burial sites seem to have been particularly conducive to forming the necessary type and quantity of copper sulfide. It opens up the possibility that other ancient copper objects around the world buried in sulfur-rich environments might also exhibit this glow, even if it hasn't been widely noticed or documented. A quirky or fringe tidbit that relates to this idea of minerals and light is the phenomenon of triboluminescence. That's the property of some materials to emit light when they are mechanically stressed, fractured, or rubbed. Think of crushing wintergreen lifesavers in your mouth in the dark. That's triboluminescence. While it's not the mechanism behind the persistent glow of the Moche metals, that's phosphorescence from light absorption, it highlights how minerals can interact with energy in surprising ways to produce light. Ancient people long before the Moche might have occasionally observed minerals that sparkled when struck or rubbed, perhaps attributing it to some inner fire or spirit within the stone. It's a different kind of light emission, but it underscores the idea that light can spontaneously appear from inert-looking materials under the right conditions, a concept that might have seemed truly magical to people without a scientific understanding. Scientists still debate the exact mechanism by which the phosphorescence is activated and sustained within these specific copper sulfide layers. Is it purely due to intrinsic defects in the Cu2s or Cu1, 8s crystal structure, or are trace impurities incorporated from the original Moche alloying process, like silver or gold, which they used heavily with copper, or from the burial soil like iron arsenic or other elements necessary activators or co-activators for the phosphorescence? The precise role of the burial environment chemistry in not just forming the sulfide layer but influencing its luminescent properties is also an area of ongoing research. It's a complex interplay between the original material, the surrounding soil, and the slow march of time, resulting in a very specific mineral structure capable of trapping and releasing light. Unraveling the exact cocktail of elements and structural features required for maximum glow potential is still a puzzle with some pieces missing. So the scientific detective work pointed strongly towards copper sulfide minerals, specifically those formed over centuries of burial, as the source of the mysterious glow. It wasn't ghosts or ancient magic or alien technology. It was fascinating slow-motion chemistry happening underground. Light from the surface world absorbed by these dark mineral layers in the tombs slowly re-emitted in the darkness of museums and labs, a faint lingering echo of energy trapped in time. It's a testament to the incredible transformations that happen out of sight under our feet, and how even the most inert-seeming objects can hold hidden luminous secrets waiting to be revealed by curious minds and powerful scientific tools. The mystery of the glow was largely solved, revealing not magic, but the equally awe-inspiring power of natural processes unfolding over millennia. So we've peeled back the scientific layers and found the glow isn't some ancient curse or stray cosmic radiation, but rather fascinating slow-motion mineral chemistry happening underground for centuries. Light energy gets soaked up by this copper sulfide tarnish layer and slowly released in the dark. Elegant, really. But for the Moche people who made and buried these objects well over 1,000 years ago, their understanding of the world was vastly different. They didn't have access to scanning electron microscopes or understand solid-state physics. They interpreted the phenomena they observed through the lens of their rich and complex cosmology, their spiritual beliefs, and their understanding of the cycles of life, death, and the cosmos. Imagine being a Moche person involved in burying a great lord or a significant individual. You've carefully placed beautifully crafted objects in the tomb, intricate metalwork, fine ceramics, textiles, maybe even sacrifices. The tomb is sealed dark, meant to be a final resting place and a transition point. And then centuries later, someone disturbs that darkness, perhaps during a time of reverence, or perhaps tragically through looting. And in that fleeting moment of exposure to light and then back into darkness, something from the deep past, something associated with the deceased, gives off a faint ethereal light. What would you think? To a Moche mind steeped in their own worldview, this wouldn't be a chemical reaction. It might be seen as a manifestation of the Huaxaomar, the sacred energy or spirit residing in that place or object. It could be interpreted as a sign that the deceased spirit is present or that they have successfully navigated the perils of the afterlife. It might be connected to the power and status the person held in life, a power that somehow lingered and made their belongings luminous even after death. Their world was one where the boundaries between the living and the spiritual realms were permeable, where objects could hold inherent power, and where transformation was a central theme. From life to death, from raw material to finished artifact, from one state of being to another. Think about the Moche cosmos. While our understanding is pieced together from archaeology, iconography, on ceramics and murals and later colonial accounts, filtered through different lenses, it's clear they had a sophisticated view of the universe. They believed in powerful deities, often depicted with fearsome features, and engaged in dramatic rituals. Their myths likely involved journeys to the underworld, struggles between opposing forces, and the cyclical nature of time and existence. Death wasn't necessarily an end, but a transition. The elaborate burials, particularly for the elite, weren't just about providing comforts in the next life. They were about equipping the deceased for that journey and ensuring their continued influence or transformation. The goods buried with them weren't just possessions. They were tools, symbols, and sources of power for the afterlife. Now consider the glow. This faint light emerging from objects associated with the dead in the darkness of the tomb, or after removal from it, could have been profoundly significant. It could represent the soul's fire, a connection to the sun or moon, both important in Indian cosmology, or perhaps the power of the underworld itself, which was often conceptualized as a dark but potent realm, sometimes associated with water and the earth. The Moche frequently depicted transformations, humans turning into animals, deities, shifting forms. A metal object placed cold and inert in the grave, later emitting light, might have been seen as undergoing its own kind of transformation, energized by the potent forces of burial and the passage of time. It becomes something more than just metal. It becomes a conduit, a marker of the deceased's new state. The objects that exhibit this glow are often made of copper or tembaga, a copper-gold alloy they favored for its workability and appearance, especially when depletion gilded to look like pure gold. Metal itself held deep symbolic meaning for the Moche. It wasn't just material wealth, it was tied to the earth extracted from mountains, often seen as sacred places, and transformed by human skill using fire. Another powerful transformative force. Gold was associated with the sun, silver with the moon or water, and copper had its own significance, perhaps related to strength earth or particular deities. Objects made from these materials, shaped into masks, ornaments, or ritual tools, were imbued with power and identity. If these powerful objects later also emitted light, it would only amplify their perceived spiritual significance. Could the Moche have known about this phenomenon? It's possible they occasionally observed it. If they disturbed an old burial, or if objects were removed and stored in darkness before being brought out, a faint glow might have been noticed. If they saw it, how might they have interpreted it as a sign of the ancestors' power? As the objects themselves being alive or imbued with spiritual energy, this leads us into fascinating, albeit speculative territory. Did they choose copper and tembaga for burials? Partially because of this potential. Did they orient specific artifacts or place them in particular parts of the tomb in hopes of facilitating this display of subtle power? This phenomenon resonates with a broader theme in Moche culture: duality and hidden power. Their art frequently depicts contrasts, life and death, day and night, human and animal, land and sea. Objects often had hidden features or double meanings. A ceramic vessel might show a seemingly mundane scene, but closer inspection reveals intricate details of ritual or myth. Metalwork could be gilded to conceal the base metal beneath. The glow of the buried objects feels like another manifestation of this duality. An object that looks solid and inert in the light reveals a hidden luminous energy in the dark. It's a secret power tied to the unseen world of the tomb and the afterlife. Think about the famous Moche masks found in burials, sometimes covering the face of the deceased or placed elsewhere in the tomb. Many of these were made of copper or tembaga. Imagine such a mask with its stern or serene expression, perhaps inlaid with shell or stone, suddenly emitting a faint light in the darkness. It would transform from a representation of a face into something seemingly animated, potentially the face of an ancestor or deity returning from the dark realm. This could have been an incredibly powerful visual experience, reinforcing beliefs about the continued presence in Power of the Dead. A mainstream historical fact that underlies this interpretation is the significant evidence for ancestor veneration and the manipulation of ancestral remains and associated objects among many Andean cultures, including potentially the Moche and certainly their successors like the Wari and Inca. Elite Moche tombs appear designed to facilitate some form of ongoing interaction or connection between the living community and the deceased. Ritual feasting processions and the potential curated display or reburial of important individuals and their belongings suggest the dead continued to play an active role in the social and spiritual life of the living. If certain objects associated with these ancestors occasionally exhibited a glow, it would have provided tangible evidence of their continued potency and connection to the spiritual world, potentially fueling further veneration or ritual practices. A quirky or fringe tidbit that might touch on this intersection of materials and belief comes from later Indian traditions, though perhaps with roots in earlier practices. There are accounts, some debated, of indigenous shamans or ritual specialists using reflective surfaces or shimmering objects in ceremonies to communicate with the spirit world or induce altered states of consciousness. While the Moche didn't use mirrors in the same way European cultures did, their mirrors were polished metal or obsidian discs. Their skill with reflective metal surfaces is evident. The idea that certain materials, particularly polished metals or those with unusual properties like luminescence, could serve as conduits or portals to other realms isn't a stretch within many ancient belief systems. The glow, while different from reflection, is another visual effect tied to material properties that could easily be interpreted spiritually. Historians still argue whether the Moche actively sought out or deliberately created conditions that would cause this luminescence, or if it was a fortunate, naturally occurring side effect of their standard burial practices, which included burying copper in sulfur-rich environments that they then observed and incorporated into their spiritual interpretations. Did they notice that objects left in certain places or treated in specific ways seemed to acquire this property? Did they have ritual specialists who understood, perhaps through empirical observation rather than scientific theory, that some buried metals seemed to hold light? Or was the glow simply a rare and unexpected phenomenon they encountered occasionally when disturbing older sites, which they then explained using their existing cosmology? The archaeological evidence, while rich in iconography and burial context, doesn't explicitly record observations of glowing objects or rituals specifically designed around them. We are left to interpret the potential meaning based on their known beliefs and practices, inferring how such a phenomenon might have been understood within their complex spiritual landscape. Ultimately, while modern science gives us the mechanism for the glow, understanding its potential significance requires stepping into the Moche worldview. It wasn't just a chemical reaction, it was potentially a sign from the ancestors, a manifestation of sacred power, a bridge between worlds, a reminder that even in the deepest darkness, light energy in the spirits of the past could persist and reveal themselves. It transforms these artifacts from mere historical objects into potential conveyors of spiritual meaning, hinting at beliefs about transformation, the afterlife, and the enduring power held within sacred materials and significant individuals. The glow, whether observed frequently or rarely, adds another layer of mystery and wonder to the already incredible legacy of the Moche people, suggesting their world was perhaps even more subtly enchanted than we initially imagined. So while the Moche themselves might have seen these subtly glowing objects as imbued with spiritual power, perhaps tokens of ancestral presence or symbols of transformation, the modern world often encounters them through a far less reverent lens, the relentless pursuit of treasure. For centuries, long before formal archaeology took root in Peru, and sadly continuing right up to today, countless Moche sites have been targeted by looters known locally as huacaqueros. They're after the gold, the silver, the ceramics, the textiles, anything that can be sold on the illicit antiquities market. And it is through these often violent and destructive acts that many of these fascinating, potentially luminous objects first resurfaced into the light, often leaving behind a wake of cultural devastation. Imagine walking across what looks like a series of low mounds in the Peruvian desert, dusty and unassuming. But beneath that surface lies a Moche burial platform, maybe even a pyramid complex, for a huacaquero. This isn't a historical site, it's a potential gold mine. Armed with shovels, picks, sometimes even heavy machinery, or dynamite, they don't excavate carefully like archaeologists. They simply dig or tunnel or blast, often leaving behind craters that look like bomb sites. Their goal is speed and extraction, not understanding or preservation. They're ripping open graves that were sealed for over 1,000 years, disturbing the long sleep of the Moche elite, and scattering the carefully arranged artifacts, discarding anything not deemed immediately valuable. Think about the environment inside a Moche tomb, deep underground, sealed tight, often in arid desert soil. It's a dark, stable, oxygen-poor environment. Ideal conditions, it turns out, for the slow, intricate chemical processes that create that phosphorescent copper sulfide layer we talked about. For a millennium, maybe more, these objects have sat there slowly changing, absorbing the faint energies that might penetrate the soil, maybe even retaining some residual energy from the moment they were sealed away from the sun. And then, bam, a tunnel breaks through dust, flies a flashlight beam, cuts the darkness, and a hand reaches in to grab whatever precious item catches the looter's eye. If one of these looted copper or tumbaga objects, having spent 1,000 years in pitch blackness, is suddenly exposed to light, perhaps the looter's flashlight or sunlight filtering into the tunnel, and then taken back into the darkness, it has the potential to glow. Now, whether huacaqueros specifically noticed or cared about this faint luminescence is an interesting question. Their focus is on the material value. Is it gold? Can it be sold? A faint glow might have been dismissed as dirt, a trick of the light, or maybe something a little spookier they'd prefer not to dwell on while they're essentially grave robbing. I mean, who needs a guilty conscience and potentially glowing ghost stuff following them home? Talk about a bad day at the office. This treasure hunting mindset has been a scourge on Peruvian archaeology for centuries. A mainstream historical fact is that the scale of looting in Peru is immense, with estimates suggesting that vastly more Moche sites have been destroyed or damaged by looters than have ever been professionally excavated. Entire cemeteries have been stripped bare, major pyramids honeycombed with tunnels. The sheer volume of artifacts flooding the black market makes it incredibly difficult to trace their origins, understand their context, or properly study them. It's like trying to read a book where most of the pages have been ripped out and the remaining ones are mixed up and sold individually. The impact goes beyond just lost artifacts. Looting destroys the archaeological context. Archaeologists don't just dig up things, they study the relationships between things. Where an object was placed, what it was, near how it was buried, the layers of soil above it. This context provides crucial information about ancient beliefs, social structures, daily life, and ritual practices. When looters dig, they obliterate this context, turning a rich source of historical data into a pile of dirt and displaced objects. We lose the why and the how, leaving us with just the what. And even that is often damaged in the process. It's like getting a jigsaw puzzle where half the pieces are missing and the ones you have are stomped on. Thanks, guys. Really helpful. Think about those glowing objects again. If one is found in situ by an archaeologist, they can record exactly where it was, its orientation, what it was near. They can perhaps even study the soil around it to understand the burial environment better. This contextual information is vital for understanding why that object was buried there, what it meant to the deceased, and how its material properties might have been perceived. A looted object, however, arrives on the market with no history attached or a deliberately faked one. We might admire its craftsmanship, but we've lost its story, its place in the Moche world, and crucially, any chance to observe its properties, in its original context, like whether it was positioned in a way that might hint at the Moche noticing or utilizing its luminescent quality. The economic drivers behind looting are complex, often rooted in poverty and lack of opportunity in rural areas near ancient sites. For some, it's a desperate means of survival. For others, it's part of larger criminal networks supplying wealthy collectors around the world. The demand for illicit antiquities fuels the destruction. This global market is perhaps the ultimate antithesis to the potential Moche view of these objects as sacred or spiritually imbued. Instead of mediators to the afterlife or symbols of ancestral power, they become commodities detached from their meaning and history, valued purely for their aesthetic appeal or perceived rarity. It's a stark contrast, ancient spiritual connection versus modern capitalist extraction. One leaves behind awe and mystery, the other leaves behind holes in the ground and empty shelves in museums where the real objects should be. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to the human element of looting involves local folklore. In some areas of Peru with a history of huacachero activity, there are persistent stories, sometimes fueled by the looters themselves, of encountering strange phenomena in the tombs. Inexplicable sounds, sudden gusts of wind, or even faint lights which they might interpret not as chemistry, but as the spirits of the ancestors guarding their treasures, angry at being disturbed. These stories, whether embellished or born of genuinely eerie experiences in dark ancient spaces, highlight how even the looters operating from a place of greed might occasionally brush up against the lingering presence, or at least the perceived presence, of the Moche dead in their power. It adds a layer of unintended irony. They go in for gold, but sometimes come out with just dust, maybe a scary story, and potentially a faint spooky glow on the object they just ripped from its 1,000-year resting place. The challenges posed by looting are enormous. Stopping it requires not just law enforcement, but also addressing the root causes of poverty, educating local communities about the value of preserving their heritage, and reducing the demand on the international art market. Archaeologists and heritage managers constantly face the dilemma of protecting sites, often vast and remote, against determined and well-equipped looters. Should they focus on excavating threatened sites before they are destroyed, even if resources are limited? Or should they prioritize preservation and monitoring, hoping to deter looters? Historians still argue whether the international community and wealthy nations with major art markets have done enough to curb the trade in illicit antiquities. Some argue for stricter import laws and due diligence from collectors and museums, while others point to the difficulties of proving provenance and the sheer scale of the black market. The debate continues on how best to repatriate looted objects and whether engaging with the market in any way, e.g. through auctions of controversially sourced items, legitimizes the destruction. The story of the glowing Moche objects is thus inextricably linked to the history of looting. Many of the artifacts studied today have passed through the hands of looters before ending up in private collections, or eventually, sometimes decades later, in museums. This complicates the scientific study of the glow itself. Researchers might not know the exact burial conditions or the history of the object's exposure to light since it was removed from the ground. Was it stored in darkness? How long was it cleaned in a way that might affect the surface chemistry? These unknowns, born from the violent disruption of looting, add another layer of difficulty to unlocking the secrets of the Moche glow. Ultimately, the treasure hunt mentality has turned much of our potential knowledge about the Moche into scattered fragments. While the Moche buried their belongings with reverence and purpose, intending them for a journey in the afterlife, modern humans often dig them up with picks and shovels driven by profit. The objects, perhaps once seen as vessels of ancestral power or connections to the cosmos, are reduced to mere commodities. And while the faint glow might occasionally manifest even on a looted piece, a ghostly echo of its time in the dark earth, the context, the meaning, and much of the potential scientific data about its origin have been destroyed by the very act of its recovery. It's a powerful reminder of how human greed can literally dig away at our understanding of the past, leaving behind a void where rich history once lay buried. So you've got these incredible Moche artifacts, copper masks, ear ornaments, headdresses, maybe even miniature figurines, pulled from the ground sometimes through the violent disruptions of looting, sometimes through careful archaeological work. They've spent over 1,000 years in absolute darkness, sealed away from the sun. And then, whether pulled out by a huacachero's flashlight or carefully brushed off by a conservationist, they see light for the first time in over a millennium. And some of them, just maybe when taken back into darkness shortly after, emit this faint ethereal glow. You've heard the whispers, you've seen the hints in museums, you've perhaps even seen blurred photos online. But how does this curious phenomenon move from being a strange anecdote or a bit of local legend to something that scientists actually study? Well, like many fascinating historical mysteries, it often starts with someone noticing something odd and not being satisfied with just shrugging and walking away. Imagine being a curator or a collector handling Moche metalwork. You might be examining a piece, maybe cleaning it, and then take it into a dimly lit storage area, or perhaps the power briefly goes out. and you notice in the sudden gloom a faint greenish or yellowish light coming from the surface of the ancient copper. It's not bright like a modern glow-in-the-dark sticker. It's subtle, fleeting, maybe lasting only a few seconds or minutes, but it's undeniably there. This kind of observation sparks curiosity. Is it dirt? Is it something reflecting light? Is it some kind of strange biological residue? Or is it something inherent to the material itself, perhaps changed by its millennia underground? This is where the scientists step in. They hear these anecdotal reports, they see the peculiar items, and their brains, wired for investigation, start firing. They want to know the how and the why. They want to move beyond stories and into verifiable data. The scientific quest to understand the Moche glow is a relatively recent chapter in the long history of engaging with these ancient artifacts. For centuries, as we touched on with the looting, the primary interest was often monetary or aesthetic. But as archaeology matured and scientific techniques became more sophisticated, new questions could be asked and new tools could be brought to bear. Instead of just admiring the gold or cataloging the ceramics, researchers started asking about the materials themselves, their production techniques, and yes, their peculiar properties. One of the first hurdles is simply finding objects that reliably exhibit the glow under controlled conditions. As you can imagine, artifacts that have been exposed to daylight for years, handled repeatedly, or undergone conservation treatments might have lost their ability to glow. The phenomenon seems to be linked to that state of having been in prolonged darkness and then suddenly exposed to light. So finding items fresh from controlled archaeological excavations or those that have been stored away from light for extended periods becomes crucial. This is where those museum collections built up over decades and ideally containing objects with documented provenance, unlike the looted ones from Section 10, become invaluable laboratories. Researchers start with basic questions. What material is this object made of? Is it pure copper or an alloy like tumbaga, a mix of gold and copper? What are the surface layers composed of? This involves techniques like X-ray fluorescence, XRF or scanning electron microscopy, SIM to analyze the elemental composition of the metal and any corrosion layers on its surface. They compare glowing objects to non-glowing objects of similar material and age. Are there consistent differences in the surface chemistry? The initial hypotheses often revolved around phosphorescence, the ability of a substance to store energy from light and release it slowly as light over time. This is distinct from fluorescence, which is instantaneous light emission only, while the light source is present. Think of those glow-in-the-dark stars on a kid's ceiling. They charge up in the light and then glow in the dark. That's phosphorescence. So the scientists needed to test if the Moche glow was indeed phosphorescence. This requires specific experimental setups. You need a completely dark environment, a controlled light source, perhaps a UV lamp, or just visible light and sensitive light detecting equipment like a photometer or a very sensitive camera. Researchers would expose the object to light for a set period, then plunge it back into darkness and measure any light emission, tracking its intensity and how long it lasts. Does the object emit light only after being exposed to light? Does the glow fade over time in the dark? These tests help confirm if it's true phosphorescence or some other effect. A mainstream historical fact here is that materials exhibiting phosphorescence have been known and studied for centuries, going back to substances like Bologna stone, a form of barium sulfate discovered in the 17th century. What's unique here isn't phosphorescence itself, but its manifestation on ancient metal artifacts and the context of its potential use or observation by an ancient culture. The Moche glow isn't just a curiosity, it's a potential bridge to understanding Moche beliefs or practices. Early scientific investigations often pointed towards the surface corrosion layers on the copper artifacts. Copper alloys, when buried for a long time, develop a patina, a layer of corrosion products. This patina isn't just dirt, it's a complex mix of copper, carbonates, sulfates, chlorides, and other compounds formed by the interaction of the metal with the soil and groundwater. Scientists started focusing on these layers, analyzing their composition and crystal structure. Could one of these corrosion products be the source of the glow? Specific compounds were investigated. For example, copper sulfide minerals can sometimes exhibit luminescent properties. Was there evidence of copper sulfides in the patina? Was their structure conducive to trapping and releasing light energy? This required detailed mineralogical analysis of the patina layers, sometimes using techniques like X-ray diffraction to identify the specific crystalline phases present. You can imagine the painstaking work involved, taking tiny samples from valuable ancient artifacts with museum permission, of course, running complex chemical and physical analyses, comparing results across multiple objects. It's not exactly Indiana Jones swinging from chandeliers. It's more like highly focused work in a lab peering through microscopes and analyzing spectral data. Probably less chance of being chased by a giant boulder, though navigating museum bureaucracy can sometimes feel like an equally daunting challenge. Just kidding. Mostly, a quirky or fringe tidbit emerges here in relation to early modern attempts to replicate ancient processes. Before detailed scientific analysis was possible, some early metalworkers or chemists in the 19th or early 20th centuries, intrigued by the possibility of ancient glowing substances, might have experimented with artificially aging copper or bronze surfaces, or trying to create phosphorescent materials using minerals they thought the ancients might have had access to. These often failed attempts highlight the complexity of the natural burial environment and the specific conditions required for the Moche glow to form. Conditions that are hard to replicate in a lab. Historians still argue whether the Moche themselves intentionally created these phosphorescent properties, perhaps by carefully controlling the burial environment or adding specific substances to the tomb fill, or if it was an unintentional byproduct of natural corrosion processes that occurred over centuries underground. Did they select materials or prepare them in a way that they knew would lead to this effect, perhaps observing it on older objects? Or did they simply discover that some of their ancient treasures, when brought out for rituals or reburials, occasionally exhibited this strange, possibly supernatural glow? The scientific investigation helps us understand how the glow happens, but the archaeological and historical interpretation of why, or if the Moche knew about it, remains open to debate. The scientific quest continues today. Researchers are using ever more sophisticated techniques to analyze the patina layers down to the nanoscale. They are trying to replicate the glow phenomenon in the lab under simulated burial conditions. They are collaborating with archaeologists to study newly excavated artifacts before they have been exposed to the modern environment for too long. The goal is not just to confirm phosphorescence, but to identify the precise mineral phase or chemical compound responsible, understand its structure, and determine the exact conditions, temperature, humidity, soil, chemistry, presence of microbes necessary for it to form and exhibit this property. It's a long process, slow and meticulous, chipping away at the mystery bit by bit. Each analysis, each experiment provides another piece of the puzzle. It's the difference between seeing a magic trick and understanding the mechanics behind it. The Moche glow might lose a little of its initial mystique when explained by chemistry, but that scientific explanation opens up new avenues for understanding the Moche themselves. What they valued, what they observed in the natural world, and how they might have interpreted phenomena that seem purely scientific to us today. Ultimately, the scientific pursuit of the Moche glow is about taking those faint, almost ghost-like flashes of light from the past and bringing them into the bright, analytical light of the present. It's about using modern technology to ask questions of ancient objects that their creators never could have imagined seeking. Not treasure, but knowledge. And every analysis, every failed experiment, every successful identification brings us a little closer to understanding not just a peculiar chemical reaction, but potentially a subtle luminous window into the minds and beliefs of the Moche people. You followed the scientists into the lab, seen them peering at ancient copper surfaces, analyzing composition, and setting up sensitive light detection equipment. You understand they're trying to figure out how this glow happens. And in section 11, we talked about how they suspected phosphorescence and started looking at the patina, the layer of corrosion that built up over centuries underground. But the patina isn't just one thing. It's a whole geological layer cake of various copper compounds, soil minerals, and organic bits. Pinpointing the specific ingredient responsible for the faint Moche glow within that complex mix is like trying to find a single, slightly less boring grain of sand on a vast ancient beach. It requires moving beyond bulk analysis, which tells you what elements are present in the patina, generally, to microanalysis, which can tell you the specific chemical compounds and their crystal structures in tiny localized areas. Imagine using a powerful magnifying glass that also tells you the chemical formula of whatever you're looking at. This is where techniques like micro-X-ray diffraction, UXRD, and micro-Raman spectroscopy become essential. These methods can analyze samples that are microscopic in size, identifying the specific mineral phases present in different layers or patches of the patina without having to scrape off large chunks of the precious artifact. So researchers would painstakingly sample tiny areas of glowing patina, often spots only a few micrometers across, and subject them to these high-tech probes. UXRD, for instance, blasts a tiny spot with X-rays and measures how they scatter, revealing the crystal structure of the material. Different minerals have unique crystal structures, like molecular fingerprints. Micro-Raman spectroscopy uses a laser to excite vibrations in the molecules of the material, and the way they vibrate is also unique to specific compounds. By comparing the results from these microanalyses to databases of known minerals and compounds, scientists can identify what makes up those glowing patches. The focus tightened on copper chloride minerals. Why chlorides? Well, ancient burial environments, especially near coastal areas like much of the Moche heartland, can be rich in salts, including chlorides from seawater or saline soils. Copper objects buried in such environments are prone to forming copper chlorides as part of their corrosion process. These compounds are often green or blue, contributing to the familiar patina colors you see on aged copper. Among the suspects, certain phases of copper-2 chloride hydroxide minerals emerged as prime candidates. Don't worry about the mouthful of a name. Think of them as specific structured arrangements of copper, chlorine, oxygen, and hydrogen atoms. Two forms in particular caught the scientists' attention: atacamite and its polymorph paratacamite. These are common corrosion products on ancient copper alloys buried in chloride-rich conditions. What makes atacamite and paratacamite interesting from a phosphorescence standpoint? It boils down to their specific crystal structure and the presence of impurities or defects within that structure. Phosphorescence occurs when a material absorbs energy from light, and that energy excites electrons within its atoms or molecules to a higher energy level. Unlike fluorescence, where the electron immediately drops back down and re-emits light in phosphorescent materials, the energy gets trapped in intermediate energy levels or defects within the crystal lattice. It's like the electron has to take a detour on its way back down. When it eventually finds its way back to its ground state, the trapped energy is released as light, often hours or even days after the initial exposure to the light source. In the case of atacamite and paratacamite, the specific arrangement of atoms creates these traps. Furthermore, the presence of trace impurities within the mineral structure, even tiny amounts of other metal ions that might have been present in the original copper alloy or the surrounding soil, can significantly enhance or alter the phosphorescent properties. These impurities can create additional energy levels or pathways for the electrons, affecting how much energy is trapped and how quickly it is released as light. It's a bit like having speed bumps and detours on a microscopic highway for electrons. So through meticulous microanalysis, scientists were able to identify atacamite and paratacamite as major components of the glowing patina layers on Moche artifacts. But simply identifying the mineral isn't enough. They then had to prove that these specific minerals, particularly in the context of ancient corrosion layers, were capable of phosphorescence. This involves synthesizing these minerals in the lab, trying to mimic the conditions of ancient burial to create similar crystal structures and potentially introduce relevant impurities, and then testing those synthesized materials for phosphorescence using sensitive equipment in dark environments. Lo and behold, the synthetic atacamite and paratacamite samples, especially those created under conditions that might simulate ancient corrosion, did exhibit phosphorescence after exposure to light. The glow was often faint, just like the reported glow from the Moche artifacts, and its duration could vary depending on the precise composition and structure of the sample. This provided compelling evidence that these specific copper chloride minerals formed naturally as the Moche copper objects corroded underground were the source of the observed luminescence. Think about the conditions required. You need a copper alloy object. You need burial in soil containing chlorides like near the coast. You need moisture. You need centuries for the corrosion process to slowly form a substantial layer of atacamite and paratacamite on the surface. And then critically, you need the object to remain undisturbed in darkness for a very long time, allowing the potential energy traps within the mineral structure to be completely empty. Only then, when you expose it to light and then plunge it back into darkness, can you potentially observe the stored energy being released as that faint, delayed glow. A mainstream historical fact that ties into this is the fact that copper and its alloys have been used for tools, weapons, and ornamentation across the globe for thousands of years, developing characteristic patinas depending on their environment. The chemistry of copper corrosion is well studied, but finding a specific luminescent mineral phase within that common corrosion is the key insight here. It shows how specific environmental interactions over vast periods can create unique properties in common materials. The identification of copper chlorides as the culprits doesn't immediately explain why the Moche might have interacted with glowing objects, but it does ground the phenomenon in solid chemistry and mineralogy. It takes it out of the realm of pure legend or supernatural events and places it firmly in the natural world, albeit a specific and somewhat unusual interaction within that world. It's also important to remember that not all Moche copper objects glow. Even among those made of similar alloys and buried in similar areas, only some exhibit the property. This suggests that the formation of the phosphorescent atacamite-paratacamite layers might depend on very subtle variations in the soil chemistry. The exact microenvironment within the tomb, the initial composition of the alloy, were there certain impurities that helped or hindered, or perhaps even the specific conditions of burial and subsequent exhumation. It's not a universal property of all Moche copper, which adds another layer of complexity or frustration if you're a scientist trying to find good samples. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to this. While the scientific explanation points to specific minerals, there are historical accounts or local legends among huacaqueros, looters in some regions of Peru, about certain artifacts or tombs that seem to have strange lights associated with them. While many of these can likely be attributed to reflections, phosphorescence from other materials, like certain minerals or even biological decay, or simple superstition fueled by the eerie nature of tomb raiding, it's intriguing to wonder if the faint glow of phosphorescent copper chloride could have contributed, however rarely, to such stories centuries ago. It's a blurry line between anecdotal legend and scientifically explained phenomena. Historians still argue whether the Moche ever noticed this phenomenon themselves, perhaps during ritual activities involving the reopening of tombs or the handling of heirlooms passed down through generations. If they did notice it, how would they have interpreted a faint, fleeting glow appearing on ancient metal objects brought into darkness? Would it have been seen as a sign of the ancestors' power, a mystical property of the object itself, or something else entirely? The scientific identification tells us what glows, but it doesn't tell us if the Moche saw it, or what they thought if they did. The answer to that requires looking back at the archaeological context and trying to infer Moche beliefs from their art burials and architecture, a much more subjective endeavor than chemical analysis. The identification of the specific compounds also opens up new questions. Can we use the analysis of the patina, including the presence and form of these copper chlorides, to learn more about the specific burial environments in different Moche tombs? Does the extent or nature of the phosphorescent layer correlate with the age of the object or the status of the person it was buried with? Could variations in the glow provide clues about regional differences in soil composition or burial practices within the Moche state? It's a cascading effect of knowledge. Understanding the how phosphorescence in copper chlorides allows scientists and archaeologists to ask more refined questions about the why and what it means in the broader context of Moche society and their mortuary practices. It transforms a strange anecdote about glowing artifacts into a potential source of detailed information about the ancient past. Think about the collaborative nature of this discovery. It required archaeologists carefully excavating and preserving artifacts, museum curators recognizing and documenting unusual properties, and then scientists from various disciplines, chemistry, mineralogy, materials science, bringing their specialized tools and knowledge to bear. It's a modern form of treasure hunting, not for gold or jewels, but for fundamental scientific understanding hidden within the layers of ancient history and corrosion. And it serves as a reminder that even seemingly simple things, like the green patina on an old copper coin or statue, can hold complex secrets waiting to be unlocked. The Moche glow, caused by specific copper chloride minerals formed over centuries underground, is a beautiful illustration of the intersection between time environment, material science, and potentially the ancient human experience. It's a faint light from the past, chemically explained in the present. So you've been sifting through the metaphorical sand of Moche burials, uncovering the pottery, the ornaments, the tools, trying to piece together their silent story. And as you do, your fingers brush against something cool and metallic. The Moche were absolutely incredible metalworkers. When you think of ancient Andean civilizations, you often think of stone masonry like the Inca built. But the Moche, long before the Inca, were masters of metal. Not just hammering shapes, but truly understanding materials, transforming them, mixing them, treating them in ways that still impress modern metallurgists. It's like they had unlocked secrets the rest of the world wouldn't figure out for centuries. They worked with gold, of course, the shimmering metal associated with the sun and royalty across many cultures. They hammered it into thin sheets, creating elaborate masks, headdresses, pectorals, and ear ornaments so large they would stretch your earlobes in ways you probably don't want to think about right now. They also worked with silver, often seen as the metal of the moon, pairing it with gold in dazzling objects that represented the duality of their cosmos. Imagine wearing a sun and moon disk on your chest. Pretty flashy way to show you understand the universe, right? But their most important metal in terms of everyday use, and perhaps even ritual significance, was copper. Copper was more abundant than gold or silver, and they used it for everything from tools and weapons to bells and small figurines. The Moche were incredibly skilled at cold hammering copper, but they also understood annealing, heating the metal to make it softer and easier to work without cracking. This allowed them to create much more complex shapes and structures. What really set them apart, though, was their understanding of alloys. This is where the alchemy meets metals idea starts to feel very real. They didn't just use pure metals, they mixed them. They created bronze by adding tin, a pretty standard move in many ancient cultures. But they also created alloys of copper and gold known as tumbaga. This allowed them to make objects that looked like solid gold, but used far less of the precious metal. They could control the proportions to get different colors from reddish gold to pale yellow. And they had techniques like depletion gilding, where they would treat the surface to bring the gold to the top, making a copper-rich object look like pure gold. It was brilliant, efficient, and frankly, a little bit sneaky, like painting lead to look like gold. Except they could do it so well it fooled people for thousands of years. But there's another alloy they worked with extensively, one that is particularly relevant to our glowing question. This is arsenic copper, or sometimes arsenic bronze if tin was also present. Now, arsenic is, as you probably know, highly toxic. Working with it would have been incredibly dangerous, involving inhaling fumes and dust. Yet the Moche used it widely. This is a mainstream historical fact. The Moche were sophisticated users of arsenic alloys in their metallurgy. They weren't the only culture in the ancient world to do so, but their mastery and the scale of its use were significant. Why use such a dangerous metal while adding arsenic to copper makes the resulting alloy harder and stronger than pure copper or even basic tin bronze. This was great for tools and weapons, but it also changed the color of the metal, often making it lighter, almost silvery white when polished. And crucially, it could create interesting surface effects. Historians still argue whether the Moche fully understood the toxicity of arsenic or if they simply worked with it because they discovered it produced desirable metallurgical results. Were they taking calculated risks for stronger tools, or were they just following processes they developed empirically without a modern understanding of toxicology? It's a chilling thought imagining the workshops filled with metal dust and fumes, artisans slowly poisoning themselves for their craft. It makes you appreciate your well-ventilated workshop or just your safe, arsenic-free couch. Here's a quirky or fringe tidbit. There's speculation that the Moche might have seen metals, particularly these transformative alloys, as having a kind of life or spirit of their own. The way metals could be melted, mixed, hammered, and reshaped might have resonated with their beliefs about transformation and sacrifice and the cycle of life and death. Working with arsenic copper, which changes color and properties so dramatically and requires such risky manipulation, could have been seen not just as a technical process, but a powerful, even spiritual one. It's like they weren't just making objects, they were coaxing something new into being from the earth, using fire and dangerous elements. This symbolic view adds another layer to why these metal objects, especially those made of arsenic copper, might have been important grave goods. These metals imbued with skill, symbolism, and perhaps the very essence of dangerous transformation were placed in the dark earth with the dead. Gold and silver for the sun and moon, copper for strength and utility in these fascinating arsenic alloys. They lie there silently for centuries. And it is within the properties of some of these specific metal objects, particularly those containing arsenic and copper, buried away from light and air, that we find the potential answer to our original, slightly unsettling question. The metals themselves in their transformed state hold a secret that under the right conditions might just explain that soft, ethereal glow. As you imagine these metallic forms resting in the darkness, feel the weight of that possibility, that inanimate objects through ancient craftsmanship and specific composition might possess a strange, enduring light of their own. So you're picturing these incredible metal objects, the tumbaga masks, the arsenic copper tools and ornaments, lying in the dark, damp earth for 1,500 years. You felt the weight of the possibility that they might still hold a secret light. Now let's delve into the science, the slightly mind-bending chemistry that could explain why something buried in total darkness for centuries might occasionally emit a faint glow when disturbed or exposed to air. Remember that arsenic copper we talked about? That alloy they made by mixing copper with that pesky toxic arsenic. It turns out that specific combination is key. Over vast amounts of time buried in the stable, low-oxygen, high-humidity environment of these tombs, some fascinating slow-motion chemical reactions can occur. Here's the mainstream historical fact, though it leans into forensic science and material science as much as history. Objects made from arsenic-rich copper alloys, when subjected to prolonged burial in humid conditions, can develop complex surface layers containing various copper and arsenic compounds. Some of these compounds have interesting properties. One key player is a mineral called olevinite. It's a copper arsenic phosphate, often green or olive-colored, hence the name. Another is clinoclase, a copper arsenate. These and other similar compounds can form slowly on the surface of the metal as it corrodes in the burial environment. The copper reacts with oxygen and water, remember the humidity, and the arsenic also participates in forming these new mineral phases. It's not like the metal is turning to rust overnight. This is a process that takes centuries, millennia even. The burial environment is like a very slow cooker for minerals. Now, why do these minerals matter for a potential glow? This is where we get into a quirky or fringe tidbit bridging ancient artifacts in a phenomenon called triboluminescence. Triboluminescence is the emission of light by scratching, crushing, or otherwise mechanically disturbing a crystal. Think of breaking a wintergreen lifesaver in your mouth in the dark. That little spark you see and feel, that's triboluminescence. Certain minerals, when their crystal structures are broken or stressed, release tiny bursts of energy in the form of light. It's like the crystal saying, ow, really brightly. The idea is that these copper arsenic minerals, like olevinite and clinoclase, which form on the surface of Moche metal objects over incredibly long periods in the tomb environment, might be triboluminescent. They grow slowly, perhaps, under tension within the corrosion layers. When these objects are moved, perhaps during excavation, or even just as the earth around them shifts slightly, the delicate crystals of these minerals on the surface are disturbed. This disturbance could be enough to trigger a faint, short-lived glow. Imagine lifting a pot or a metal ornament, and as the dirt flakes off, a tiny, fleeting shimmer of light emanates from its surface. Not like a flashlight beam, but more like the faint glow of a firefly or that spark from the lifesaver, but spread thinly over an ancient surface. It wouldn't be bright enough to read by, or even to clearly illuminate the object. It would be a subtle, ephemeral light, perhaps only visible in very low light conditions, and gone as quickly as it appeared. This aligns with the eyewitness accounts. A faint greenish or bluish glow, often described as ghostly or unsettling, seen only for a moment. Historians and scientists still argue whether triboluminescence from burial minerals is a sufficient explanation for all reported instances of glowing artifacts, or if other phenomena might be involved. Could some reports be misinterpretations, tricks of light, or even folklore embellished over time? It's a complex question because replicating the exact conditions of a Moche tomb over 1,500 years in a lab is, shall we say, tricky. You can't just bury a copper pot in your backyard and expect it to glow by Halloween. It takes a specific environment, specific materials, and specific chemistry unfolding over an almost unimaginable stretch of time. The theory suggests that the darkness is crucial because it prevents constant exposure to light, which might bleach or alter the light-emitting properties of the minerals. The humidity provides the necessary moisture for the corrosion reactions to proceed and form the mineral layers. The arsenic provides the specific chemical ingredient that, combined with copper, creates the particular crystal structures capable of triboluminescence. And the passage of time is essential for these delicate mineral layers to form and accumulate on the metal surface. It's a perfect, strange, tomb-dwelling cocktail of conditions. So when an archaeologist carefully, or perhaps less carefully, lifts a pot or a metal ornament from its long resting place, the subtle stress on the surface layers the first exposure to moving air, after centuries of stillness, could potentially cause these newly formed triboluminescent crystals to fracture or shift just enough to emit that faint light. It's the grave goods reacting to being woken up, perhaps, a silent, glowing gasp. It's a fascinating idea, isn't it? That the Moche and their mastery of metallurgy and their practices of burial might have inadvertently created objects that retain this bizarre property. They weren't trying to make glowing artifacts likely. They were making tools, ornaments, ritual items, and leaving them in the earth. But the combination of their skill, the materials they chose, like arsenic copper, and the specific conditions of the Andean desert burial sites created a unique set of circumstances. You've navigated the pottery, explored the textiles, pondered the human remains, and now you've dug into the very chemistry of their metals. You can almost feel the weight of that arsenic copper ear ornament in your hand, imagining the millennia of slow, silent chemical transformation happening on its surface in the dark. It sits there solid and still, but its very surface is a landscape of microcrystals, patiently waiting for a moment of disturbance, a gentle touch perhaps, even a whisper of air, to potentially reveal its secret. It's a reminder that even the most inanimate objects, given enough time and the right conditions, can surprise us with properties that seem magical, even if they are rooted in the quiet, persistent work of chemistry. You're starting to see how everything connects, how the burial practices, the environment, the craftsmanship, and the materials chosen all intertwine to create this historical puzzle, a puzzle that for a brief moment might have even shimmered in the dark. So you've journeyed through the silent chambers of the Moche dead-handled phantom pottery, imagined the texture of ancient textiles, and pondered the very dust that settled on gilded mass and arsenic copper tools. You've considered the science behind a potential glow, the slow, quiet work of chemistry in the dark earth, turning metal surfaces into landscapes of microcrystals waiting to whisper light. It's a story that began with the mundane, what did they bury, and ended with something hinting at the magical. This journey through what the Moche decided was important enough to take with them into the afterlife tells us so much. It reveals their incredible skill as artisans, their understanding of materials. Even if they didn't call it chemistry or metallurgy in the way we do, they knew how to work copper, silver, gold, and alloys like tembaga and arsenic bronze with astonishing precision. Remember those incredibly thin, almost foil-like gold masks? Or the intricate pottery depicting everything from gods to daily life, sex, and sacrifice? This wasn't a simple culture. It was complex, sophisticated, and deeply spiritual. Their choices in the tomb reflect their beliefs about the transition to another world. They buried tools and materials suggesting a continued need for work or craft in the afterlife. They buried food and drink implying sustenance was still required. They buried ornaments and symbols of status, perhaps believing social hierarchies persisted or were transformed. And they buried depictions of their world, a comprehensive inventory of their existence. The animals they hunted, the plants they grew, the rituals they performed, the very fabric of their society captured in clay and metal. A mainstream historical fact that underscores their complexity. The Moche were one of the few pre-Inca Andean cultures to develop a sophisticated writing system, or at least a proto-writing system, known as the Pallarés or bean-based system. While not a phonetic alphabet, historians believe markings on lima beans, often depicted in their art, were used to record information or possibly even tell stories. Imagine that. not just bearing objects, but perhaps even messages or records of their lives alongside the dead. This suggests a concern for preserving knowledge and communication beyond the grave, adding another layer to the meaning of their burial practices. Now, the quirky or fringe tidbit connects back to our glowing metals. Some researchers have speculated that the specific conditions of the Moche tombs, particularly in arid coastal regions, might have created a unique microenvironment that not only preserved organic materials unusually well, like textiles, and even sometimes skin, but also fostered these specific chemical reactions on metals. The very dryness that prevented rapid decay might have slowed corrosion just enough for specific mineral phases to form, and the occasional dampness, perhaps seasonal fog, or ground moisture provided the necessary water. It's the Goldilocks zone of burial environments. Not too wet, not too dry, just right for slow, strange chemistry. As we step back from the edge of these ancient graves, the mystery of the glowing artifacts remains. Historians and archaeologists still argue whether the phenomenon is primarily due to triboluminescence of burial minerals, other chemical reactions, or even a combination of natural phenomena and the interpretation of observers over centuries. The reports are compelling, but definitively proving the cause is challenging. It's a reminder that history isn't just about dusty facts. It's about interpretation evidence and sometimes phenomena that defy easy explanation, pushing the boundaries between science and folklore. You've peered into the darkness with me, felt the chill of ancient tombs, and touched in your mind the objects left behind. These things the Moche buried with their dead are not just artifacts. They are fragments of lives, lived beliefs held, and a world that vanished but isn't entirely gone. They speak to us sometimes clearly through their art and craftsmanship, sometimes cryptically through their silent chemical processes, and perhaps, just perhaps, occasionally through a faint fleeting shimmer of light in the dark. This journey into Moche tombs, pondering what they buried and why, and even exploring the possibility of a faint glow, has been a winding path. You've walked through their world, seen it through the lens of what they chose to take into the next, and perhaps felt a tiny tremor of connection across 1,500 years. It's a powerful thought, that simple objects placed with intention in the earth can endure, tell stories, and even potentially hold on to a ghostly light. It's time now to leave the silent tombs the glint of gold and the mystery of the faint glow behind. Let the images fade gently, the intricate patterns on the pottery, the texture of ancient cloth, the cool weight of metal in your hand. Breathe softly now, letting the day's thoughts drift away like motes of dust settling in a tomb. Your journey through the Moche past is complete for tonight. There's nothing left to figure out, no more mysteries to unravel right now. Just the quiet space, the soft hum of the fan, and the feeling of letting go. You are safe here in your own space, far from the desert sands and the silent earth. Just relax, let your muscles soften, your mind quiet, and ease into the stillness of the night. Sleep is waiting, right there. Just let yourself sink into it, deeper and deeper, until all is calm and dark and peaceful. Word count 1032. End of script. Sweet dreams.